Building for an ever-changing society. Over the last century, Europe's building stock has increased enormously. Buildings are often created with only one function in mind. When societal needs or user preferences change, these monofunctional buildings usually become outdated or even obsolete. It's often easier to erect a new building instead of initiating a long-lasting and expensive refurbishment. Demolishing buildings generates a huge amount of waste. In short, current building practices use a lot of material resources, but in an ineffective way. Imagine what would happen if we embraced a whole new vision of buildings as material banks. Seeing a building not as a fixed and final object, but rather as a temporal and dynamic storage of valuable materials and components. A building that can easily be changed in response to changing needs and preferences. A building that can be disassembled into parts that can be used again for a new purpose. For example, reusing floor tiles as a facade finishing, reusing windows in a new greenhouse, and repurposing copper wiring into electronic devices. So let's start designing buildings in a reversible way. Buildings that are made of components that are easy to assemble, replace, transform, disassemble and reuse in new applications, avoiding waste and downcycling. It sounds good, but is it realistic? How to avoid toxic materials and how to guarantee quality and safety of reused materials. To do this, we need to keep track of materials within buildings. So materials will need to have a passport, an electronic data record containing information on content, quality, function, past uses and maintenance, as well as guidelines for disassembly and options for recycling and reuse possibilities. Great, but where will this data come from? Who will manage it? How will we deal with confidentiality issues such as patents or private user data? This calls for collaboration and transparency across the value network of building owners, financiers, designers, contractors, material suppliers, service providers and policymakers. To make collaboration work, we need to identify added value for all actors involved, not only building professionals and financiers, but also end users. Circular business models can do just that. One-time sales are replaced with long-term service agreements in which building products can be used and reused within the built environment or repurposed for alternative applications. These models should provide a continuous revenue stream for the producer while improving affordability for the end user. Additionally, by making building components reusable and buildings adaptable, their value is better conserved through time, strengthening the business case for long-term investors. First, a change in design culture is required, supporting the future reuse of the building and its components. Second, we'll need to define, create and capture value in a different way than we are used to. Environmental and societal values need to be integrated in the decision-making process. Last but not least, we need to change the way we manage and share building data. Thinking of buildings as material banks can open up new opportunities for a more resilient future. New instruments such as materials passports, reversible building design protocols, new ways of gathering and sharing information, circular business models, and new policy measures and incentives need to be tested. Are you inspired to embark on a new journey towards a circular and reversible built environment? Are you brave enough to experiment with building the future? Then visit our website to find out more.
This is the Zero Energy Bills home. It's designed by Z Factory, stands for Zero Fossil Energy Developments. The homes of today could generate approximately double the amount of energy that they need to sustain them over the course of a year. It's been built by a builder plucked from the Yellow Pages, and he's built one of the most energy efficient homes in the UK with almost no prior training. It uses simple, natural materials assembled with an electric screwdriver, and we're building homes like this in Barking and Dagenham at the moment, taking about 6 weeks per house. It's designed so that the majority of the roof faces south. This harvests enough solar electricity to meet double the annual energy demand, leaving you enough energy to charge your electric car for about 5,000 miles and get you to work. What it shows is that the highest possible energy performance standards could be easily met by the construction industry if banks and funders wanted to allow this technology through onto the open market. So all of the ideas from the Zero Bills home have been distilled into the smallest house pretty well in the UK, which is a ZEB pod. And this has been designed to decouple the cost of providing housing from the cost of purchasing land. These are prefabricated, zero carbon homes with no net annual energy bills. They're powered by the solar panels on the roof, just like the Zero Bills home. They're super insulated, literally arrive on site and are bolted together in about 4 hours. And they can be taken away again because they sit on rubber pads. So you can pick this house up with zero waste, move it, reconnect it to the local services just using very simple techniques. So it uses the air rights above areas of car park to provide an urban system capable of housing somewhere between 70 and 250,000 young key workers in the UK.
So this is Chris and Sally's house. It's a house all about if you live with dementia. It's very much designed to be adaptable. Based on how people's needs change, the house can be adapted to suit their needs using Loughborough University research.
Yeah, so people do a lot of improvements to their home. This is giving some additional design principles that will allow them to live as long as they want to in their home. We've got clear sight lines through the house so people can see what's going on, who's approaching the door. Sight lines out into green space as well, so there's a stimulation. So we want to keep people as stimulated as possible and active as well. We've got a wet room that can easily be adapted to allow for physical and mental disability later on in life. We've got a day room here that could be a dining room but then adapted into a bedroom later on.
So it's very much designing with the future need in mind.
Indeed, and not designing it in such a way that it becomes specifically a special needs property. It's easily to reverse that effect as well.
Great. So we're standing outside the flood resilient repair home. This shows circularity in a number of ways. It's an old Victorian stable block, and what it's showing in terms of flood resilience is how we need to think about adaptability and plan for future events. So the whole thing is about being able to stay in this house if a flood event occurs.
Yeah, the sort of extreme weather events come around too often these days, so people who get flooded often get flooded again 2 to 3 years later, and if the home's been reinstated with a standard palette of building materials, those have to be ripped out and used all over again. So this project demonstrates the use of robust, resilient and resilience built into the design. Well, we've chosen materials that will be robust. So for example, we've got the ceramic wood effect tiles, so they can be washed down easily. We've got a flood resistant kitchen. The carcass is made of a timber resin composites that can be repeatedly flooded, and the doors themselves could be immersed for up to 3 weeks at a time. What we're doing, we're providing a resilient approach to reinstating that property so we don't waste resources repeatedly.
Yeah, we're saving a lot of materials, aren't we?
Yes.
Yep.
Hello Diff fans, I hope you enjoy this film that we're creating here at the BRE Innovation Park in Watford. I'm going to be sitting around the kitchen table with Gilly Hobbs and Catherine from the BRE Innovation team, Nitesh from BAM Group, Bill Dunster, an innovator who's actually designed the Zero Bills house behind me, and Philip Guthrie, who works on built environment projects with the London and Waste and Recycling Board in the City of London. We're talking about examples of innovation that give us hope that our buildings could one day be fully circular. Don't forget to join in the conversations yourselves at #ThinkDiff. Okay, so Gillian, we all live in houses. They're often one of the biggest consumers of our bills, or at least my bills anyway. But why are buildings interesting places to talk about circular economy?
Yeah, well, as you say, we all live in homes, we all work in buildings, or most of us work in buildings, and quite often, or mostly, it's the biggest investment we make, and yet there's very little thought quite often given to how do you optimise the materials within the built environment. And we've been working at BRE, we've been working for many years on resource efficiency within the built environment. For example, a building gets demolished. Ideally, a big chunk of it gets recycled, but not always. There's very little reuse that happens quite often. But then conversely, you've got a built environment that's having to use quite huge quantities of new raw materials in the form of new products and materials coming into the built environment. And it's, so you've got a big consumer of materials on one hand, and then you've got a big waste producer on the other hand. So there's been some real progress made in terms of how do you improve recycling of construction, demolition, refurbishment waste.
And this is going to be quite a positive conversation because we've managed to assemble a panel of people who can really talk about the kinds of innovations and things that are actually actively being implemented in buildings and in the built environment that can shift us towards a positive future. And obviously we can talk about some of the challenges as well. But actually we are sitting, Bill, in an example of innovation in the built environment. Can you give us the quick 45-second pitch, because we've been doing a tour this morning of this building.
Okay, well this is a very ordinary house. It's a 4-bedroom home, but it's designed to have no net annual energy bills. So by reducing its energy demand to a fraction of a conventional home, and then facing more or less 2/3 of its roof facing south, it generates enough energy from solar energy to both meet its annual total energy demand and run an electric car for about 5,000 miles a year. So we think this is an example of building integrated renewable energy systems. It can be scaled up for urban, it can at an urban scale, it can be used for retrofitting existing buildings, combined with super insulation and energy efficiency. All electric systems don't require gas. In terms of circular economy, I think this building shows how you can use very low embodied carbon materials, locally sourced. You can assemble them very, very quickly. You can use virtually unskilled labour to do so.
And maybe open that question out to everyone. Let's have some more examples of the kinds of innovations and things that are already happening today. I mean, maybe starting with you, Nitesh.
Yeah, so we've been working in the Netherlands mainly, where there's a client driver or government drive to be circular. So by 2050, for example, there should be no net raw material usage. So by 2030, 50% reduction, and that's spurred on the market. So we get questions from clients all the time. We built 2 circular buildings last year.
What's a circular building?
Okay, so let's say a circular prototype, where we're thinking about the use of materials, not just for once, not just a one-time use, but thinking about how they can be reused again and again. but essentially we want to keep the value of those materials at its highest level or the highest utility for as long as possible. So thinking about the design process, for example, where we're talking to our architects, trying to change their mindsets, look at different materials, put in place different business models to try and utilize materials for longer or to get performance contracts in place. So we've done all of those things, as well as reuse old buildings and try and put them into a new use.
So we've got an example of a building that produces more energy than it needs. We've got an example of building projects where we're fundamentally rethinking the relationship with materials and how we able to reuse the materials. What else have we got in terms of exciting examples of innovation in this space?
Well, we're working on it's a project looking more at the business case, so looking at the sort of business model and the client business case about reusable buildings. So that could be anything from a temporary building that you can put up and then move because the need has changed, maybe housing, demographics, or school, or adapting a building. So say a school year is bigger in one area for a certain period of time, you can expand the school or contract the school according to demand. But that's looking at trying to get the clients on side and understand what the economics are for making that stack up, basically.
And I'm conscious that actually maybe all three panelists so far have mentioned the word clients already, and I suppose who you're building for, who's paying for the build, is kind of an important topic here. I understand, Catherine, you've been doing quite a bit of research in this area.
Yeah, I mean, clients are key. The supply chain will react to what the client wants. So if you take some of the hot examples in the Netherlands, the clients very much work with their supply chain to have a really clear vision and strategy for those buildings. But it is dependent on the client interests and how we align circular economy thinking with that. So if you've got a client with a longer term interest, if they're public funded, education, social housing, they should be thinking of more whole life value, and then you can make the argument stack up a bit better in circular economy thinking. If you've got a shorter term interest client, so an office developer who's looking to resale, it's all about how you then add it onto the investment value, and then you may look at sort of principles of adaptability and flexibility. You could also look at sort of materials you use and how they link into well-being and productivity. So it's really sort of the message you make to that client in the way that they think.
But what you're suggesting there, or at least implying, is that there is a case for all clients.
I think there is. For example, I've been working with the infrastructure clients quite recently. They think
Just for anyone who's not clear, what's an infrastructure?
So they would be road, rail, power stations, those sorts of things, and they think very differently because their assets are very, very long term. So you don't really go to them with the argument about how you need to design for deconstruction, end of life. It's more about how you can make that asset, maximise that asset use through adaptability, through flexibility, all about the asset management piece and smart maintenance and those sorts of things.
Is one of the challenges in this whole space that so many of the projects are quite long term, like buildings have very long lifespans. Does that create any challenges in terms of, if you're putting out a phone that's going to be in 4 years you're going to have back, it's quite easy to make the business case for you should get that back and do what you can with the materials. But if you've got a building that's going to be around for 25 years or 30 years, hopefully however long, 100 years. Okay.
Thousands of them.
Is that actually a challenge to recovering materials? I don't know if maybe Gillian, you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's important to know, to understand the asset and how long is it likely to be there. And I actually think, Bill's house, the Z-Pod house, is a really excellent example of how it's probably not going to be there for hundreds of years. And so it's been designed to be, right, okay, when it's fulfilled its purpose in one place, you can take it down and put it somewhere else. And I think that in itself is showing a sort of intelligence in terms of how do we optimise these assets. We don't necessarily have to make the asset short-lived, but we can make the business case, the business model work for being able to move it from one place to the other, if that's the sensible thing to do. But then you also can have very long-lived assets, and I mean, we've been doing a lot of work on this Buildings and Material Bank project, a European funded project, on making the best decision. How do you make the best decisions? And actually it's hugely context driven, and you almost have to that's part of the really important work that you have to do before you've done anything else in terms of, am I going to use this deconstructible beam, or am I going to use this reclaimed product? It's really trying to pin down what's the context. So we're doing this thing where we're saying, okay, the business as usual scenario, so say like the office building with the retrofit, this is what would normally happen. What if you did it differently? What if instead of putting a disposable partitioning system in, so when you wanted to change the configuration, you had to basically knock it down and put a new one in. Instead of doing that, what if you had a reusable partitioning system that could move around the building or go into another building? What difference would that make from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective? And the numbers would change according to, what you put into that decision-making tool, essentially. Because if you're going to change a partitioning system every 10 years over a 60-year lifespan, and then you're using a reusable partitioning system as the alternative scenario, then you can build up some quite significant financial savings and also environmental savings.
The findings of what you're looking at, is that suggesting there is a benefit to having that flexible partitioning? I guess it... Yeah. I mean, that's the ultimate
Well, depending,
conclusion.
but if you knock the building down after 5 years, no, you wouldn't.
Are you doing whole life footprint analysis on this?
Yeah, that's what we're doing. I mean, but also we were trying to change some of the boundaries of how you do this analysis. So, and it's actually found it quite challenging in terms of...
What do you mean by the boundaries of... what's the friction point there?
Well, we have very standard assessment methods for life cycle analysis, life cycle costing, which we can use because you can just report. You can report in a broader sense and still use the same standards, but actually they're not ideal for looking at multiple building life cycles.
So how do you shift the thinking around industry that has a really set of standards that it's judging success by? Is that the sort of challenge that you're...
So recently, so I mean that research project, but then also in the London plan recently, there's they've set out that for big referable projects you have to do a circular economy statement, which is actually just it's a kind of decision tree tool for clients actually mostly, or that's where it's focused at this point in time, to try and get them to think about alternative uses. So, like I was talking to a client recently who has loads of heritage assets, and they still want to develop those heritage assets. So even though the building's been there for a long time, they still need to reuse elements of it, and they're actually forced not to knock the whole thing down. But so the idea around the circular economy statement is that it takes clients through those different options about, can I reuse the asset that already exists on the site, or if I do need to knock it down, what can I do? How long do I want it there for? And do I need to design for adaptability or flexibility around certain timeframes?
I think also BRE's BREEAM environmental assessment methodology also fits in with that quite nicely, because that's incentivising clients to get credits for just thinking a bit more about things they probably wouldn't necessarily do. So credits, for instance, for doing a design for deconstruction plan on the new build, a pre-demolition audit if you're demolishing.
What's a credit, or what?
So credit,
what are they getting out of
those
this?
sorts of schemes like BREEAM, you get a rating basically.
Is it from the government policy mechanism?
Some governments will require, and local authorities will require BREEAM, and you get a rating in terms of outstanding.
It should be government policy.
But it's holistic. It's more holistic. It's not. It's sustainability. It's like a voluntary. Most cases, a voluntary sustainability standard.
Yeah. So you get the more credits you get, the better your score, and then so the highest you can get is outstanding.
I mean, most people would say, why should I take all the issues in BREEAM? It'd be so much easier if I didn't. Therefore, I won't try and recommend that the client adopts it. Does anybody agree with me on this?
Well,
I see
so
what
is
you
this
mean.
why, maybe in the Netherlands, is that why, is it the government that's sort of like making it happen, do you think?
Yeah, it's incentivised, isn't it?
Yeah.
So generally we know that even clients in the UK, they might start talking about embodied carbon, for example, and we've had projects where, we've got to the point, where we're just about to build something and then that requirement just drops away because it's not incentivised. The government are not asking for it and they realise, actually it's extra work for everyone, so we'll just drop that one. And I think the same goes for a lot of people. They'll just go for the cheapest or the simplest way of doing something. So just going back to your earlier point, what are the challenges? I think that's lack of awareness, where, for example, clients might have a very short-term view. I'm basing my KPIs on what I build today, and someone else manages it. And therefore you've got a split incentive.
Key performance indicators, that's what KPI.
Yeah.
And that's why we've set out when we're moving into a new office today, which is very exciting. Thanks. Yeah, but we set out with quite a tight budget to try and do it a bit more in a sort of circular way. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we've looked at remanufactured furniture, we've looked at alternative plasterboards. We kept quite all the meeting rooms within the space that we had. Some stuff that was already there, some carpets and stuff like that. So we've tried our best to reuse it. We reused the entire kitchen despite moving it. So, but it's been a massive challenge, and actually it's taken quite a lot of our time to sort of invest in it and research things. And
What is the role of cities like London in this challenge? We've talked about like policy and how crucial it is perhaps in the Netherlands in enabling things to happen where it doesn't enable things to happen in the UK. Do cities have any sort of agency in this space, or what? I mean, it's quite a complex myriad of different regulations and standards and actors within the value chain. But where do cities sit?
Yeah, I think cities have quite a core thing, because I think there's obviously lots of people all within a close proximity. There's lots of innovation, and so it's that. There are some things you can do policy-wise to encourage innovation, encourage the circular economy statement, kind of encourage new practices in buildings. But I think I guess recognising that there's lots of stuff all together. There's buildings coming down at the same time that there's buildings going up, and I think there's a massive opportunity there for not only city authorities to help and facilitate, but also the businesses and working together. Basically, I think there's a big onus on everyone collaborating together to make the best use of the resources we have.
So again, in the Netherlands, or mainly starting from the Netherlands, or our experience from the Netherlands, where we've been designing and building circular offices. So we took a car showroom, finished it last year, and we retrofitted that into an office space or a maker space as well. And what we realised by trying to keep the costs down, to get investment for this over a 10-year period, because it's a leasehold property, and having to guarantee that residual value after 10 years, it made us really think about where do we get our materials from, how can we ensure that value, or the guarantee that it's going to be fit for purpose for 10 years, if not longer, and then what do we do with those materials afterwards. So residual back value became a key thing for us in verifying that we can meet a minimum residual value after 10 years. And it also made us realise that getting hold of reused surplus stock or other materials from the market was really difficult. So we took the initiative of developing a circular building platform, so a digital marketplace for reusing materials, and that should be industry-wide. So we're just about to launch we've done the concept, the MVP, and now we're just launching, finding partners and then trying to accelerate that for the industry.
That's all about trying to link up supply and demand, isn't it? And knowing what's in your building. And because one of the issues with reusable materials, trying to get them for your project, is they're not there when you want them or at that time. Yeah. And that's probably where cities come in as well. It's such a basic issue, but just having storage for materials, because we're not, unfortunately, in the world where we know what's in our buildings and we know exactly how we can reuse them when and where.
Yeah, so Gilly obviously made the point of lack of data, that's exactly the issue that we need to tackle. So we come up to an existing demolition or a refurbishment, and we don't know what to do. Often the decision is, let's start again, because we don't know what that is.
Presumably
we don't know how it's
historically
valued.
there's been no record of, I mean, we can talk about...
There are records of existing buildings, but it's not kept in one single place. People don't know how to interpret that information, and it essentially gets lost. It's too difficult. So when you start thinking about, do you add sensors, or how do you keep information attached to buildings that you're building now to make sure that the next life is secure?
When we built BedZ, I worked with somebody called Nicole Lazarus.
Sorry, BedZ, did you say?
Beddington Zero Fossil Energy Development. It's a small village done for the Peabody Trust. I designed it in 1998 and it was finished in 2002. And it's built trying to use reclaimed materials or local materials, and indeed local labour. For example, we had a steel frame for the mixed-use workspace units. We got that from reclaimed sites at construction site at Brighton Station. So we reused steelwork directly. We reused timber from local houses being knocked down to avoid, having to use steel partitioning systems, because steel is a higher embodied carbon product. A lot of work was done to achieve that, and it was entirely possible, but really, really hard work. But there is another dimension which I do want to raise, which is really exciting. We did the London Pavilion at the Shanghai Expo, again, with no money. I gave the students at the Beijing College of Art £100, and I said, come back with a chair for a big conference room. We had to put 150 chairs in and make it out of reclaimed materials, and I've never seen anything so beautiful. Every single chair was different, really colourful, really expressive of individuality. So we can use art to transform, to get the circular economy working. It's not all about big business.
That's quite interesting, because we did a project, both me and Cathy did a project a few years ago with Salvo, who sort of like, they represent a network of reclamation companies in the UK, called the Truly Reclaimed Wood Mark, because there's this trend to put stuff into like hotels and restaurants, and it looks like some of it is genuinely old wood, but some of it is just made to look like it's old. So it's like fake, distressed or fake reclaimed timber, as I called it. Fake reclaimed bricks. I mean, like that just like sends shudders down my spine, basically. And so we did this project, just saying, okay, if we had this truly reclaimed wood mark, would it make a difference for a kick-off? And what would be the incentive behind people looking for it? And we did some market research about, it's normally like self-builders or domestic, people that are doing extensions that use reclaimed materials in the UK reclamation market. A lot of heritage. It was like, why do you use it? Would you want a mark that showed you the environmental benefits? Would it be financial savings? Would it be quality issues? And actually, the thing that came back stronger than anything else was, there was like a little QR code on my truly reclaimed wood label, and then I could scan that, and it would show me information about the building where it came from. So the history and the story and the uniqueness that you were talking about, that's the thing that would give it value. And
integrity.
It is, isn't it, as well? Because if you design a building that people value, they'll want to save it. They won't want to see it demolished if it does have intrinsic value. You do get people that campaign to get buildings listed and saving from demolition. So, so if you use materials, and reclaimed materials are usually very aesthetic. So it's thinking a bit wider, really.
And I don't think it's just like old materials as well.
No,
we know some guys who are using potato peel to make like something like chipboard kind of thing, and it just has a fun story to
that
it.
is so
biodegrade.
Is it technology that's the key to unlocking some of those opportunities because of the proliferation of data? Where is innovation generated from? Is it top down? Policy measures? Anyone want to jump on that one?
I think innovation, I think technically we're great as an industry. We can come up with loads of solutions. You know, the industry is full of engineers, they're innovative people. We just need to provide them in the challenge in the right context and they'll come up with a solution. I think the innovation is needed in process. So how we think, how the risk that, you know, that the clients have, how we finance things, how we collaborate with people. I think we need to be much more innovative in just the way we work with people, the way we procure, the way we set up contracts, and that involves people, which is a much harder challenge, I think, in terms of we've got to change people in terms of how they think.
So, are you saying that it's siloed currently, or what's the sort of collaboration challenge at the moment?
We are capable, but often we don't have governments or cities, you know, people like Advanced London or LWARB pushing, you know, innovation to sort of, you know, incubators where actually we're thinking of different solutions. And that doesn't happen enough.
Actually, we're punished for trying.
I would also say investors. Like, I think investors and the quantity surveyors, I think they're the ones who are holding the purse strings, like, for big developments, and I think they're not involved in the conversation. They don't understand.
Well, investors are starting to sort of clock on to there's a whole big opportunity. You know, obviously there's a calculation by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that, you know, 8 billion or whatever as an opportunity. So banks, you know, that we're talking to are trying to understand how they can invest in circular outcomes. So one of them, for example, is trying to use a company like ours to reach out to supply chain. So in order to leverage solutions through a large construction company, how do you get to the supply chain who are ultimately going to come up with the solutions? And that's a challenge, you know, as we've seen on previous projects.
But solutions are already there, they're just not being asked for.
Yeah, but also a lot of the existing supply chains don't want to think differently because they're thinking too short term. Yeah, so they don't want to come up with those solutions.
But there's an awful lot of supply chain product out there already.
Yeah.
Lots of small innovative companies who aren't being given a chance and aren't being used.
Yeah, so we're going to those types of companies that otherwise may not be a regular supply chain, but they're sort of one-offs, you know, they're sort of, you know, on their own, and it's not scaled up.
It's getting them in front of clients, isn't it, really? Yeah. Getting clients to think differently, innovatively, and the whole issue of risk and penalties.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. The reality is you're actually punished for doing this.
Yeah, there's a perceived risk in doing things differently. And it's like, it's like, why would you do, what's in it for me? And you always have to sort of come back to that ultimately. I think this is how we're doing lots of sort of interesting innovation, research, demonstration. I think we need to sort of get our messages out in a way that it's, if you're in a particular position, if you're a client, or if you're an investor, or if you're a supplier, you can say, okay, well, what's in it for me? Why should I do things differently? And if the risk or the penalty outweighs the benefit, then why would anybody do things differently? But I actually think we're getting to a situation where, you know, we know the cost of resources are going up. We know that there's, you know, the volatility in resource prices is getting more and more severe. And so I think not even just the small operators in the supply chain, I think a lot of the big suppliers are now thinking, okay, how do we make sure we've got this sustainable supply of materials and products? I think that's where the sort of product innovation is going to come in. A lot of it is where you're trying to make sure, you know, for example, this window is going to be somewhere for maybe 20 years, but actually if you can make sure you get that window back as a supplier, then you've got your future, you can build up your future feedstock for decades to come. And I think this is where having this data, so one of the things in the BAM project is having a material passport, so you've got this better data on the products that are going into the building. But then the other aspect of the project is about reversible building design. So you're putting products into a building in a way that they can be either maintained more easily or they can reverse out without damaging them, for example. Just some of it's quite simple stuff, but it's like, you know, we haven't set ourselves up to deal with the future the way that we should do. And I think this is where a lot of the innovation and the research is plugging a real knowledge deficit.
Speaking about optimism and the need for investment, Our last question is, hypothetically, I've got £1 million. What would you do with it? 10, 15 second pitch, what would you do with £1 million? Maybe we go from Gillian around.
Well, assuming I've got to spend it on
You've
circular
got to spend it on
economy.
this.
Okay, that's just
You're not off somewhere.
I just do demonstration project. I think you learn so much from just doing it in reality rather than, you know, theorising about. You need to do the theory, but I think doing stuff in reality.
I was going to add that, but I mean that's a good one. I think also I'd look into like storage, like and consolidation, like we were talking about. If there's a way to kind of release some land to do that kind of consolidation, that's one thing. And then the other thing I would say is on sort of is those small innovative rethinking projects. So like people coming up with crazy products out of waste materials. I think that financing those kind of things or allowing those to grow would be amazing.
Well, I've got the same answer as Gilly really. I think demonstrators, both in terms of technically, both in terms of process, so get whole supply chains to collaborate.
People can work together.
Yeah, totally. And also identify the business case and be really honest about that. You know, it's very hard to get any data in terms of what the business benefits are. So
More work needed then.
More work needed, but I'd just be more transparent with it and be more aware. And I think, you know, people will take a clients who are a bit sort of risk averse will take more assurance if there's more evidence out there.
All of the above. And I think we need to solve the existing, like the problem that we have with existing buildings. We talked about data and information. There clearly isn't enough of it. There's not enough exchange of materials. So I'd try and put money behind solving that through practical demonstrations, I think.
I'd try and tie in the environmental benefits of the circular economy, particularly with regard to reducing and accelerating climate change. So I'd like to quantify it. So I think probably that's where the work really could go. If you could, for example, I had a conversation with the Chinese housing minister. Half of the carbon footprint for China annually is embodied carbon, building new urban infrastructure, urban expansion. New buildings we're designing, half of their lifetime carbon footprint is embodied carbon and maintenance carbon. Half is running carbon. So if you can basically use carbon as your currency, you can explain the benefits of the circular economy. Otherwise, frankly, we're into runaway climate change, and that should give an urgency to the whole thing. And by the way, seal off the M25. Massive reduction in air pollution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the environmental building's main focus when it was designed 24 years ago was energy efficiency, so demonstrating the latest energy efficiency thinking. So it's got passive ventilation systems, there's no artificial ventilation, and it also had what was at the time the latest photovoltaic system, though that's been replaced with a much more efficient system since. But it also presented an opportunity to look at work relating to recycled and reclaimed content. So having achieved a 96% recovery rate for the demolition of the building that was on here before, we then moved on to the new building. So what could we do to optimise resources in that new building? So this was split really into two areas. So maximising the use of recycled aggregates and replacement cement. And then the other aspect was maximising the use of reclaimed products. So for the recycled aggregates, we were able to demonstrate that you could use can 100% recycle coarse aggregates in concrete, again for the first time anywhere in the UK. The other aspect that we looked at was reclaimed bricks. So they've got 80,000 reclaimed bricks that came from a local hospital, and reclaimed flooring that came from a project that the contractor was doing at the time, the refurbishment of County Hall in London. It's quite successful in its own right as a demonstration project, but actually what was more interesting was probably the lessons that we learned from that. So one of the key things was a pre-demolition audit. We've gone on to do many pre-demolition audits, and we very recently launched a code of practice to be able to make sure that the targets set within the pre-demolition audit are actually carried through to the demolition process. So that was, that's a useful outcome from this building. We also created a quality control protocol for using recycled aggregates, because nothing like that existed. And that's actually was adapted to become the end of waste criteria, or the new quality protocol that's now being used across the country for using recycled aggregates. And then the other element that we looked at was working with the reclamation sector to really understand what's the size of the sector, how do we promote greater use of reclaimed and products and materials within the built environment. And it's actually on that last point where there's still quite a lot to do, and this is where the work we're doing on the EU research project, Buildings as Material Banks, is really important, because it's having the tools available to be able to make sure that we can much more easily look at reclaiming and reusing our built assets into the future for many years to come.
This is built by the Prince's Foundation for the Built Environment. It's interesting from a circular economy point of view, because a lot of the materials they've used are biological and renewable. And when we talk about circularity, a lot of that is keeping biological materials as biological and can go back into the biosphere and get renewed and recycled.
As you say, a lot of materials are renewables: clay, timber, wood fibre, hemp fibre, sheep's wool. These are all part of that renewable approach. What you see is the whole construction of the wall there. There's no additional insulation required. The clay blocks themselves are insulating.
So a good example of not requiring extra materials, because it is insulating and long lasting as well, which is important for circularity.
Yeah, the key to this is longevity. You build it once and it's robust.
So to the left of me we have the renewable house. As the name suggests, it's built with renewable natural materials, and John's just going to say a little bit about what they are.
Right, so the construction of the wall is hemp and lime mixed together and compacted into the wall structure itself. When we go around to deconstructing the house, we'll then look at how we could either reuse the material or maybe compost it and put it back into the ground. But it looks like a standard property, a 3-bedroom property, so there's nothing too unusual about that.
So this building is really more of an example of a reusable building, in the sense that the whole module can be reused, i.e. transported elsewhere and reused on another site.
Yeah, the concept's called meanwhile housing. So if you've got a 5-year development on a site, you could be using these at one end of the site and move people into the permanent homes, and these can then be located to the next site as required.